Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Newsagent podcast. I'm Susie Lysett, Senior Content Executive at Goodlord, and today we'll be taking a look into the concept of lifetime deposits and deposits in general to see what the next steps may be following the Renters Reform Bill white paper proposals. So to help me on this topic, I'm joined by Steve Harriott, CEO at the Tenancy Deposit Scheme. So thanks very much for joining me today, Steve.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, for those listeners out there that perhaps don't know who you are and what the Tenancy Deposit Scheme is, perhaps if you could just kick us off first and just tell us a bit about you and the company.
Yeah, so I'm one of those people who have more job titles than most people, because although I do run the Tenancy Deposit Scheme in England and Wales, we also run schemes in Scotland, Safe Deposits Scotland and TDS Northern Ireland, and the parent company is the Dispute Service. Not a great name for a company when you're trying to promote harmonious relationships between landlords and tenants, but there you have it. So, my day job really is overseeing all of our work in deposit protection and dispute resolution across the UK.
Fantastic. Well, that's a good overview, and obviously you're the right person to talk to for this, considering that the many hats that you wear. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah.
I think then one of the first things that we could perhaps do is just set the lay of the land as it is now. I think, again, you're the right person to do that. So obviously, as you mentioned, in England, Wales, Scotland, there are kind of different systems in place across the rental landscape for deposits. So perhaps if we could start there, if you wouldn't mind giving us a bit of an overview as to what's in place across these different countries.
Yeah, of course. And I think the reason why there are differences across the UK is simply because housing is one of those services which is just devolved to the local administrations. So if I start off in England and Wales, tenancy deposit protection has been a statutory requirement since 2007 across those two countries. And we have two versions of deposit protection in England and Wales. One is a custodial scheme where landlords agents are required to transfer their deposits once they've been registered to the scheme, and we're one of three schemes which operates in England and Wales. We also operate an insurance-backed scheme, so this is where landlords or agents register the deposit with us, but where they pay a fee to do that, and they keep the deposit in their own bank account during the tenancy. The reason it's called insurance-backed is not because the deposits are actually insured. What it means is that we have an obligation that if a tenant doesn't get their deposit back from a landlord who has protected the deposit in an insurance-backed scheme, we will pay the money to the tenant. We will try and recover it from the landlord, and we have insurance in the background to support that. In Scotland, legislation changed in 2012. So in Scotland, again, there's a requirement for all landlords and agents to protect tenancy deposits with one of three schemes. So our scheme in Scotland is called Safe Deposits Scotland. It's the biggest scheme in that country. There's only a custodial version in Scotland, so there's no insurance-backed scheme. And then across the water, the Irish Sea, you go to Northern Ireland, and they've had deposit protection in place since 2013. TDS Northern Ireland's the biggest scheme in Northern Ireland. We have 85% of the market there. And they, like England and Wales, have the two versions. They have a custodial scheme and they have a insurance-backed scheme. Just to give you a bit of scale, in England and Wales, there are currently between the three schemes operating 4.2 million deposits in protection as we speak, worth just over £4.5 billion.
Blimey, that's a lot of money that you're protecting there. Just out of curiosity, why is Scotland that bit different for between the custodial and the insured side?
I think a lot of this is political, if I'm honest. I think the Scottish government looked at what was happening south of the border and the fact that we had these two different types of scheme down here. They decided that they felt that in Scotland it would be better for landlords not to hold deposits in their bank account. So they were really keen, I think politically in Scotland, to see deposits handed over for safekeeping to organisations like mine. But then a year later in Northern Ireland, the politicians there looked at what was happening in England and Wales and in Scotland, and they didn't go down that route. So they've gone down the insurance-backed and custodial version. So it is different because of the politics. There are some other differences as well. So, for example, in Scotland, the maximum deposit a landlord can take is 2 months' rent. In Northern Ireland, there's no limit on the level of deposit, although it can be 1 to 2 months in practice. In England, however, with the Tenant Fees Act in 2019, deposits have been capped for most tenancies at 5 weeks' rent. But Wales, which has a joint scheme on this with England, doesn't have a deposit cap. So, it's even confusing for us, this variety of deposit protection requirements across the UK. And every country has different rules for how quickly you have to protect a deposit and how soon you have to serve prescribed information.
That is quite a lot of variation across those nations. And would you have
landlords, I think, who have deposits across the jurisdictions? So if you're a letting agent in the north of England, you could well have deposits held in Scotland. So there are some of those geographical boundary issues. And in Wales as well, on the England-Wales border, there are letting agents who are working in both jurisdictions and have to accommodate these differences of approach in the different jurisdictions.
No, and obviously knowing the right rules in particular in this situation is quite crucial, because it can have a knock-on effect further down the line and,
Well, mainly the knock-on effect is there because if you look at the penalties for getting this wrong, they're all essentially the same. So if deposits are protected late or not protected, or prescribed information is not served, you're in for a penalty of between 1 and 3 times the deposit. And that's a significant penalty when deposits can be in parts of London, for example, £2,500–3,000. So getting this right is important.
Well, I think that's a great overview and a good way to set the context of the discussion that we're having today. I think that perhaps now we can turn to look a little bit at the Renters Reform Bill. Obviously, it's a bit of a topic of the moment, or it has been for a number of years, really, but now it seems to be gaining that little bit more momentum. Before we take a look at the original proposals specifically around lifetime deposits and what the government's now outlined in the white paper, perhaps we could have a look at the fact that they've now proposed moving to a system of periodic tenancies, obviously sort of moving away from assured short-hold tenancies and transitioning to periodic tenancies. What impact, if any, do you think that this will have on the deposit system as we have it currently?
I don't really think it's going to have a fundamental impact, if I'm honest. The deposit is taken at the start of a tenancy. And in our current world, where we have these fixed term tenancies that can be either renewed or switch over into a statutory periodic tenancy, it doesn't really change the deposit position because that's paid at the start of the tenancy. So when we move to periodic tenancies here in England, and there's a different system in Wales, which will be coming into force in December. But when it comes into impact in England, at the start of every tenancy, there'll be a deposit that is required to be paid usually, and that will have to be protected in a scheme. So I don't think there's going to be a massive impact. I think there are some landlords that don't like deposits going into a statutory periodic position, and they'll often issue a new fixed term tenancy, and in those cases they currently have to reprotect those deposits. In some cases that's not going to occur in this new model. But in effect, I think what the English government is talking about is moving to a situation as we currently now have in Scotland, where they essentially have that practice in place, and we haven't seen a big impact north of the border as a result of that change in legislation.
It does seem that quite frequently Scotland seems to take that jump first, and then in England we follow suit. So it's nice having that model that we can perhaps base assumptions on about what the impact will be.
Correct, yeah.
And obviously one of the other proposals, again, not specifically about lifetime deposits, but around pets. This is one of the other proposals which has come out of the Renters Reform Bill, the fact that landlords will obviously be encouraged more to allow tenants with pets, or make sure that they don't unreasonably withhold consent. I think it was something on those lines anyway, in terms of the actual white paper. Obviously, though, in order to allow that, what they're proposing to do is change the Tenant Fees Act and allow this extra fee, this extra payment really, in terms of pet insurance. Again, what impact do you feel that may have on deposits? I guess this whole concept of encouraging more pets, because I'm assuming that there must be a component of deposits and deposit disputes which tends to come with pets and potential damage.
So this is one of these areas where I think I do actually have some concerns about what is happening. And it's also, an unintended consequence, I think, of changes that were made back in 2019 under the Tenant Fees Act. And clearly, during COVID, the level of pet ownership in the UK increased significantly. I mean, I think the RSPCA told me that they think over 50% of households now in the UK have a pet, cat or a dog. That's a very high number. And given how many people live in the private rented sector, I would be not surprised if that figure was also replicated in the private rented sector. Now, 3 years ago, before the Tenant Fees Act, the way that most landlords dealt with this, if they were going to allow a pet in, they would take a pet deposit. Now, a pet deposit wasn't a separate deposit, but it was effectively an add-on. They might take, they might have taken a month's rent for the sort of core tenancy deposit, and they might have said, look, give us another 2 weeks rent and we'll call that a pet deposit. And it just meant there was additional payments in the deposit that could compensate the landlord if the pet caused damage, or there were fleas, or the banister was chewed. All of these things we have seen in our deposit disputes. But the government outlawed that because they essentially capped the deposit at 5 weeks rent and stopped this sort of concept of a pet deposit, an additional pet payment to be allowed. And of course, that has caused a problem because, whenever we do surveys around pets, there's a lot of concern expressed by landlords about the damages that pets cause. And there's often horror stories that, we see. I think in reality, however, we don't see a lot of disputes about pets, explicitly about pets. In our deposit disputes, most of the complaints are to do with a lack of cleaning or a damage to fixtures and fittings. Now, in some of those, pets will have contributed, particularly around carpets, for example, which can be damaged by pets. But it's been really difficult for us to provide hard data about the amount of damage caused by pets. So we don't think it's a huge problem in terms of damage. But now if I come to the white paper, I think it does make sense to encourage landlords to take pets, given there are so many pets around in the private rented sector. And it also makes sense to try to help landlords manage the consequences of that. But the thing I'm concerned about is that the suggestion that you can require the tenant to pay for pet insurance as a permitted payment under the Act, I think fails to recognise that at the moment, most pet insurance products exclude damage to landlords' fixtures and fittings. And the logic for that is that it's difficult for an owner to control what a pet does, 24 hours a day. You don't have that control issue. So, and we have spoken to insurers in this market over the last 18 months, I think, because we anticipated this being a problem. And we have struggled to find insurers that are willing to provide that type of third-party cover, either in a pet health policy, because most pet health policies are obviously, as they say, are designed to deal with a pet being ill. So we spoke to them about, could you do an add-on that would cover landlords' damages? They weren't really interested in that. And then we spoke to insurers that are providing, tenants with insurance. And again, this area of liability for landlords is something most of these policies exclude. So I think the challenge for government, if they want to take this forward, is working with the insurance industry to see if there's a sensible pet policy, insurance policy that can be developed. And then my other concern about it is most of these pet policies would insure the tenant for the cost of any damage that they incur that is actually to the landlord's fixture and fittings. So you can have a situation where a tenancy ends, the landlord claims against the deposit for damage, but the landlord may still think, there's an extra, £300 or £400 of costs that they're going to want to recover from the tenant. But what they're going to have to say to the tenant is, well, go and claim off your pet insurance and then pay me the money from that pet insurance. So unless there's a model that gets the landlord to be the beneficiary of the pet insurance product, I think that's another barrier to making this work. So you won't be surprised to hear that as a result of that, my view on this and my recommendation to government will be, why not consider, changing the Tenant Fee Act to allow an additional pet deposit. It was a system that worked well prior to 2019. It's a genuine unintended consequence, I think, of the cap on deposits, but I suspect it's a more workable solution than the one that's currently being proposed.
No, it certainly seems that this pet deposit concept, it would reduce the delay perhaps between people getting paid and having to go out and ask for insurance and things. It would just remove that delay that would happen in the process, so that a tenant can move into their next property without having to worry about that for an extended period of time and things like that.
I think so, because if you think about it, the deposit is there to manage damage caused by the tenant and also their pets. But if you've got a situation where there's been quite a lot of damage done, it's probably not going to be covered by the 5-week deposit. So I think it's an area that generates a lot of interest from landlords and from tenants and from pet lovers. But I really do hope that as the white paper is discussed and as the bill comes out, that there's room for people like us, landlords and tenant groups to get together to come up with a workable solution.
Well, I suppose that's one of the important things about this white paper. It is just a white paper. It isn't the full sort of draft legislation at this stage. So it does still leave that scope and that time period to have those conversations just to make sure that it is correct, when it actually gets through to the final stages. We'll be right back after this message.
Do you want to stop wasting time on admin and jumping between different platforms to get just one job done? Do you want to focus on your agency's business goals instead? From automated offer letters and e-signing to online referencing and even rent collection, Goodlord can help your agency get rid of the admin-heavy parts of your lettings job in one integrated platform, so you can refocus on your business and your customers. Head to goodlord.co today to learn more. Goodlord, it's just that good.
Well, that's already a fair bit covered on deposits, and we've not even really got into lifetime deposits yet. So let's turn to this concept of lifetime deposits now, and let's take a look at perhaps where next for this concept, which is obviously, I believe, raised back in 2019 originally. I believe I'm correct in saying. So perhaps initially, if you wouldn't mind explaining a little bit around what those original proposals were, what is a lifetime deposit?
So at the heart of this, it relates to the problem that some tenants find when they're moving from one rented home where they already have a deposit to another one where they've got to pay a deposit. So this issue of double deposits, really. And the problem is that, you won't get your initial deposit back for some weeks after the original tenancy's ended. But before you can move into your next home, you've got to pay probably a different landlord a deposit. So there's a gap which needs to be bridged. So the government, was talking about this for some time before the 2019 general election, and they were hung up on this concept of passporting. So this is the idea that a tenant has an existing deposit. Why can it be passported through to the next landlord? And that is a great idea and could be done if there was no risk that some of the first deposit would be taken to pay for damages to the property. Because what happens then is if you say to the second landlord, don't worry, your tenant's deposit is going to be passported over. It might take a few weeks, but you'll have it in the next 2 or 3 weeks. What happens if all the deposit is lost? And then you've got the second landlord saying, hang on, I was expecting you to passport £1,000 to me. There's nothing. What's going to happen? So the concept of passporting makes sense, but it doesn't work in a situation where there are quite often deductions from deposits. And in fact, over 50% of deposits end up with some sort of deduction being made. It's lost in about 6% of cases in full. but then there's obviously a scale of deductions that get made. So the government has been, was politically committed to the concept of a lifetime deposit passporting. And then they spent the next 2 or 3 years trying to work out what they could do. And there's quite a lot of discussion both with us and with consultants within the department, who basically concluded this is difficult to do for the reason I've just explained. So the government, I think, have moved away from that original concept. So you'll see in the renter reform white paper that they're no longer really talking about passports in deposits, or they're not talking about a proposal for lifetime deposits. What I think they're saying in there is that let's look and see what the market, how it might respond. And it is responding, I think, in 2 ways, and potentially a third one, which I'll raise. The first is deposit replacement insurance, zero deposit type solutions, where essentially the tenant doesn't pay a deposit up front, but pays for an insurance policy that insures the landlord at the end of the tenancy for any losses that might be incurred. And then the tenant has to pay back the insurance company at the end of the tenancy. So it's like a cash flow issue. It's switching the emphasis from paying up front to paying at the end. The second thing that government is looking at from the market is the concept of deposit bridging loans. So this is the idea that at the end of the first tenancy, the tenant is moving, and could they go and borrow money on a low cost basis from a lender just to fund that new deposit for 2 or 3 months. And there are lenders now starting to come into this space, and we'll need to see what happens. In reality, actually, at the moment, most of the tenants in this situation are borrowing from somebody, but they tend to be borrowing from friends and family. The bank of mum and dad is making that work. And I guess there is an issue there, because actually if most tenants who are doing this are borrowing from mum and dad, are they going to pay a lender some interest for a deposit bridging loan? I think we'll have to wait and see on that one to see how people respond in that area. The third thing, which I think we're looking at, is how can we speed up the return of deposits? Because actually this is only really a big problem if there's a big gap between moving out of one property, getting your money back, and then getting your deposit paid on the second one. If we could streamline that gap, could there ever be a world where tenants got their deposit back if there are no claims the day they moved out?
It'd be fantastic if that were the case.
in the home ownership sector, don't you? You people sell and buy properties on the same day, back-to-back deals. Probably unlikely, but is there stuff we could do to try and speed up this return? The most obvious one would be saying to landlords, look, when a tenant moves out, you really need to give them the deposit deduction proposals within, 10 days, 2 weeks of the tenancy ending, to try and give a bit more certainty as to when the tenant may get their money back. And there are some other things like allowing tenants to pay deposits by instalments. That does happen with some landlords, but could that happen more? And also encouraging employers to give deposit loans. So my company, for example, we will pay the deposit on behalf of a member of staff and recover that from them either at the end of the tenancy or as they're working month by month.
No, it sounds like there are a fair number of different possibilities out there. And do you anticipate that one will come to the fore or the others will sort of drop to the wayside? Or do you think that will kind of continue this mixture of different options available?
Well, if you look at it at the moment, we already have deposit replacement insurance products, and there are differences between them, and we're involved with zero deposits, so I need to declare an interest there. So there are already products in that market. So I guess over the next 2 or 3 years, I could see some innovation happening in that particular space. There are a couple of lenders who are working in the deposit loan market, and I think there's going to be some more coming into the market in the next few months. And if they take off, I imagine others will come in. But because we haven't tested the deposit loan solution on a large scale basis, we don't really know whether this is going to take off. Will tenants, purchase these loans? Are they going to be seen as affordable? and will lenders, have an appetite, for making those payments? So we need to wait and see. I do think, however, that the concept of passporting is probably dead. I think the idea that somehow these deposits could be switched between landlords probably isn't ever going to see the light of day.
That does seem to be what the white paper sort of suggested. It was very much at the tail end of the document, I think. And sort of obviously focused on the fact that it would help support some of these market-led solutions, but wouldn't necessarily invest more time doing its quite as much high-level research as it perhaps suggested initially.
Yeah, correct.
No, it's all very interesting. And just one query, again, just out of curiosity within that, the idea of the bridging loans and that side of things. Do you see any impact of, I think that tenants are supposedly getting older, or sort of, incrementally edging up there, and talking about using the bank of mum and dad. Do you think that will have any impact? Do you think that it could be almost like there are different products for different demographics of renter or anything like that?
Absolutely. And if you go back to the politics of this, the big concern I think that government had was, tenants on relatively low incomes not being able to access the private rented sector. So, if you're a professional earning lots of money in the city, paying the second deposit is not really an issue for you. You're not going to use a deposit loan, and you're probably not going to use deposit replacement insurance. But conversely, if you're a very low income tenant who's in the private rented sector, can't access social housing, don't have much spare money, one of the challenges for us is going to be, can they afford even to take out a deposit loan? Will they pass the credit tests that are required? Same issue for insurance providers, because obviously the insurance providers in this space, have to face the prospect that at the end of the tenancy, if they're paying out for damage, they need to recover that from the tenant. So all of these solutions I don't think they're all of market solutions. I think potentially at the low income level of the market, there's more room for local authorities and housing associations potentially to offer deposit bond guarantees to landlords. So they already exist. It's a bit of a patchwork quilt across the UK, but that may be much more appropriate to help those tenants' mobility within the PRS than thinking about loans or deposit insurance.
And also just on the concept of attempting to streamline that process, just to get that turnaround much faster in terms of getting the deposit back into tenants' hands and so on. Is that just as simple as finding the right technology to make it possible, or is it a lot more complicated than that? Is it in terms of the risk and so on that's involved?
Yeah, I think the technology does have a role to play, but it's more, I think, thinking about what happens at the end of the tenancy and thinking about how technology and different approaches could help. So typically, what you need to see happen is before the tenancy ends, that tenants are reminded of their obligations. You've got to clean the property, got to make sure that, you're leaving the property in the same condition that you got it, go and look at the inventory when you moved in, is it at the same standard that it was now? So there's a bit of work to be done, maybe a month before the tenancy ends, and that could be automated. Technology platforms could automate that. We send out reminders to tenants to say, when you're moving out, just make sure that you're leaving the property as you expected, and where you're going to put the keys, make sure the bins are put out, all this sort of basic stuff. And we've seen some really good technology platforms that automate that. Fantastic. Then making sure that when the tenant actually moves out, you get the inventory done as soon as possible. And again, that's a mixture of staff time, either the landlord or the letting agent going around doing the inspection, or outsourcing it to a third-party company, and then getting the results of that checkout inspection finalised and sent to the tenants for checking. That can be all done electronically. There's some really good providers out there who are providing that type of solution. And early getting agreement from the landlord or the letting agent as to what deductions you want to see from the tenant, and again passing that through to the tenant really, really quickly. So I think it's a mixture of technology, staffing arrangements, and also potentially landlords or letting agents recognizing that it's important they do this promptly, and don't let it drag on for months and months and months.
It seems that there is a fair few steps in that process that will that can be looked at to break it down and to just make everything a bit more efficient.
Yeah, and I think, if there is a dispute, tenants can refer those disputes to us, and we have a role to play as well, making sure that when the dispute comes to us, that we look at the complaint quickly. We often pick the phone up and talk to the landlord and the tenant to see whether we can resolve it online or on the telephone, rather than waiting for a long drawn out dispute resolution process. So we have roles to play, and at the moment 25% of our disputes are resolved that way. We've given ourselves a target of trying to deal with 45% of disputes just by picking the phone up and talking to the parties and trying to reach an agreement. All of this helps. It's an incremental approach, I think, to speeding up the end of tenancy returns and making sure that people can have quicker mobility between homes in the private rented sector.
It seems that there are a few different steps in the process that can be looked at, like I said, but perhaps no single solution. So it's been a very good conversation, but I don't think we fixed it necessarily during our conversation, but we've definitely outlined some of the opportunities, some of the challenges there. Before I bring the conversation to a close, would you have any other predictions in terms of where deposits may look in the future, or perhaps the impact that the Renters Reform Bill may have in terms of the deposit system as it is now?
I think that deposits will remain with us for a long time. They're an established part of the renting experience. I think landlords in particular are keen on them. I think there are some moves. I think big corporate landlords, landlords with purpose-built student accommodation, some of these providers are looking at the situation and saying, look, we don't need deposits. We'll manage the risk on a corporate basis. So I suspect that if we see the greater dominance of larger landlords in the marketplace, they may come up with different solutions. I do think deposit replacement insurance has a role to play, and I suspect that will continue to grow, albeit slowly. I don't know about deposit loans. I think it's a very new thing, and we'll have to wait and see. But I do think there will be, like everything in this life, there will be an increasing expectation that we speed things up, and that's where I think a combination of great technology that is integrated, that enables the renting experience to be swifter, will be allied with an expectation that staff deliver great customer service and make this process less painful, I think, for everybody that's involved in it.
Yeah, I think that's a very succinct way to wrap up, and a good note to end on, because I think it's applicable in more areas than just deposits, as you said. So, thank you ever so much, Steve, for having a chat with me today. I do think that's been incredibly interesting, and hopefully it'll give our listeners out there just a bit of an idea as to where we're at now and where we may be going next in terms of tenancy deposits. So thank you ever so much.
Good. Thank you.